Hello and welcome to Düzdan Shah English. My name is Ismail Jalilov and I'm an Azerbaijani and American journalist living in the United States and broadcasting from Washington, D.C. Normally, we broadcast in Azerbaijani, in the language of my native country, and sometimes in Russian, but from time to time we have guests who prefer to speak English. So today is one of those days, and I always introduce myself in case you happen upon our channel for the first time, so you would know what this channel is and what it does. We broadcast into Azerbaijan, as I said, for the Azerbaijani-speaking audience around the world, and we highlight issues that nobody else does or the media in Azerbaijan are not allowed to do to the extent that we can, being based abroad. Today, our guest is Richard Kauzlarich, the former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. We would like to welcome him. Hi, how are you?
Hi, good to see you, Ismail.
Absolutely. Good.
I wish it was in person rather than by Skype, but this will
exactly.
do.
We've met a couple of times in the last year, and we interviewed you for our channel face to face. But due to COVID restrictions, it's still not safe to do so. That's why we thought we would do it by Skype this time and see how it works. Mr. Ambassador, does Azerbaijan look a little different to you now since our last meeting about maybe 4 or 5 months ago? There seems to be a stream of news coming from the country, and in the previous conversation you mentioned that the country has not changed much since your ambassadorship there starting in 1994, if I'm not mistaken. But lately, does anything suggest that the country is going through some sort of a change in politics and social area, what have you?
Have taken place too that have affected the global economy. So I think I would, in fact, answer the question a little differently. First of all, because of the disease itself, every morning when I get up and turn on my news feed, I look at the numbers of cases being reported in Azerbaijan, and they continue to go up. And I know there's been a lot of discussion in the think tank world here in Washington about the impact on the region. But I think for Azerbaijan in particular, because of its unique position between Russia, Dagestan, and Iran, it's kind of caught in the middle of a kind of a perfect storm relating to the virus that has had a major impact. And my heart goes out to the people of Azerbaijan because of this. One thing that hasn't changed is that the measures that the government has taken against independent journalists and political opposition figures have continued. Regrettably, they have used the COVID-19 as an excuse to undertake further measures. I think the third thing that I would mention that has changed has been the economic impact, not just of the virus and the shutdown of the Azerbaijan economy and society, but also because of the impact on global energy markets, which has caused prices to go down and increase the economic pressure on Azerbaijan. So I would say two things have changed dramatically since we last talked. One, the virus itself, and second, the developments in the energy market. But one thing hasn't changed, and that's the ongoing oppression of any voice that speaks out either about the virus or about developments in general.
I would like to start by apologizing. We had a few seconds in the beginning there where when your voice wasn't heard, but I think we fixed that mishap. My apologies.
That's okay.
So, in terms of the government's reaction, in terms of the COVID-19 restrictions, or rather restrictions that the government is trying to package as a response to COVID-19 measures, looking at the situation from the United States, do you think that in this particular situation, we're also going through a turmoil in the United States? Do you think the people are making better decisions when they have more information or less? I feel like I'm asking a rhetorical question, but I'm trying to enlist your help in understanding the reaction of the Azerbaijani government, the logic behind it. Do you think the people are making more educated decisions? Do you think it's easier for the government to operate in a vacuum?
Well, I think that the one thing that Azerbaijan has done that unfortunately we in the United States in this current administration have not done, and that is listen to the WHO. I think U.S. policy toward the WHO generally, and particularly as it relates to the virus, has been wrong. And I think Azerbaijan pays attention, and I think that's really, really important at this time. What I'm concerned about, and I'll have to say somewhat concerned about in the case of the United States, there are efforts to suppress information about the extent of the virus. We've seen it in the United States at both the national and the state level, but also we've seen it in Azerbaijan, certainly in the early days, where there was kind of a effort to not make the public aware of what was going on. Now, on the general issue of information, information alone isn't enough. And sometimes we have too easy access to information, and we're making decisions that really scientists and medical doctors are really only in a position to interpret. So I think the more that can be done to make the public aware of the best numbers that governments have, and to have public health experts speaking out on that about what measures do or do not make sense in this environment, that's where the information is needed. But I really think that this is not a national problem in any respect. It's a global problem, and I think the WHO in particular really plays a very important role for all of us in helping us navigate this very uncertain future.
Of course, this coronavirus pandemic seems to make everything more complicated and nothing easier, including the resolution to conflicts.
Yes.
The nations, I would think, would be more determined and have a better chance to, better field to operate in order to solve issues. But newer and newer conflicts seem to pop up, and unrelentingly so. In terms of the resolution of the old conflicts and new conflicts, do you think that the coronavirus pandemic, does it exacerbate the problems? Does it instill a stronger will in countries to approach issues, tackle them together? What does it look like on a global scale, or you can scale down to a particular region if you would like?
Well, I think some of the old conflicts continue unabated. I mean, in the Caucasus region, obviously Nagorno-Karabakh, the U.S. tensions with Iran continue. And I also think that for the U.S., as we have for reasons, again, that I'm not entirely in favor of, disengaged both with multilateral organizations, not just the WHO, but NATO, as well as individual countries who have traditionally been allied with us and who we turn to in previous pandemic-like situations with Ebola, for example. The international cooperation simply is not there. And I think whatever you think about U.S. leadership generally, the ability of the United States in the past to mobilize countries and to work with international organizations has been the defining feature. There was, a short period of time when it seemed like some of the ongoing conflicts, such as Libya, in Yemen, with Saudi Yemen war, were being put on hold, but that seems to have disappeared now, and those conflicts are coming back. I think the real problem will be in the future, whatever the motivation of governments is. There's this expression that we use in the United States when we talk about policymakers having enough bandwidth to make decisions and to assess problems. Well, the bandwidth is just not there today because correctly, you've got the coronavirus, you've got the economic downturn and economic recovery from that. How do you get policymakers enough time to start looking at conflicts which may, on the broad scheme of things, seem relatively minor in terms of policymaker priorities? So I think it's a combination of kind of the breakdown of this consensus to work internationally, and secondly, policymakers being so consumed with the problems relating to the virus and the economy that they can't devote the attention that they have.
So this consensus to work internationally. In the conflicts, the U.S. position has always been respected and listened to, maybe not always acquiesced to, but always heard. Do you think that the behavior of the United States at the top level these days, does it make America more respectable, more fearsome, or does it damage the view of the United States that the United States has forged for many decades since the World War II?
Well, we'll see some evidence of that in the next 3 or 4 days. The U.S. has played now for over 2 decades a very active role in the Balkans in helping resolve conflicts there. As you know, when I left Azerbaijan as ambassador, I went to Bosnia and Herzegovina as ambassador. And our policy, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, has been to work with allies, try to create the capability of people in the region who had been at war for a long period of time to create a peace on the basis of multi-ethnic societies. And now today we have this very strange situation where unilaterally the United States has invited the presidents of Serbia and Kosovo to come to Washington. I think it's the 27th is when the meeting is supposed to take place. And this just runs contrary to the whole framework that we had in place of developing a European consensus for solving the remaining problems in the Western Balkans. Now that's broken. And it certainly is going to be very, very hard for us to go to the Europeans and say, we want your cooperation on China or Iran or whatever the Trump administration believes is the foreign policy issue, when we've kind of walked away from them and done it in a very public and I would say disrespectful manner. So to answer your question, we'll see what happens just in the next few days, whether that show of strength, I think that's the perspective of Grinnell and the Trump team, is going to gain respect, or will the memory of a failed effort to unilaterally reach agreement where agreement has been difficult in any event to take place shows that the United States is not the leader that it thinks it is.
Since you've retired from active foreign service, you and we consume news as ordinary citizens. Maybe you read a little more, maybe I read a little less, but we basically read more or less the same stuff. When it comes to the revelations reverberating through Washington these days, I'm alluding to John Bolton, former National Security Advisor's book. What was very interesting for the people in Azerbaijan was the part concerning China and Uyghurs. You understand, of course, there's some sort of a heightened interest towards China because it's a leader in the region that is being more and more assertive, if I may say so. And also, Uyghurs speak a Turkic language. Maybe that is another reason why. What do you make of the entire Uyghur situation in Xinjiang province and the reaction of Trump administration, as reported in the book by Bolton that we've seen excerpts to? Of course, neither you nor I have read the book, but we've seen probably pretty accurate excerpts in the media. Any ideas on that?
Well, I have not read the book, and I will not be buying the book. So I have to rely on what other people are saying. I just have to, I mean, just from the reporting of this particular aspect, it sounds very believable to me because I think from the earliest days, this administration has taken a position which I can only describe as anti-Islam, and therefore, when an issue like this, which is clearly involves a minority population in China, which is Islamic, you can see that an administration would not be as concerned about the human rights of these people compared to other countries where they speak out on human rights, like Venezuela and Iran, just to name two. Also, knowing, again, as you say, from the media, the operating style of this administration, I could see where there would be a willingness to trade what would be the natural U.S. response to the creation of what could only be called concentration camps by the Chinese for some promise or hopeful development on U.S.-China trade relations. I could see that being a reason for it, but I think it's really very, very sad to see this issue being shunted aside at a time when the story has not been in the media really much in the last few years because the Chinese have shut down any presence of outside or even domestic media in that part of China. I think it's sad because it undercuts our standing in the world to speak out on other issues. I happen to think human rights issues in Iran are important for this administration, whether it's Trump or some other one to speak out on. But it undercuts us when we refuse to say what needs to be said about this very tragic situation.
As an American, what sort of an emotion did you feel when you read allegations that the sitting U.S. president has enlisted support from a government like China's in return for, let's say, turning a blind eye to the construction of the concentration camps, as you termed it, and the media have, in China to oppress an ethnic minority? Did it surprise you and scare you? And what do you think people around the world will perceive the United States as when they read this kind of news? As a diplomat, shall we say, for a second, let's imagine you're still a diplomat and you're still doing what you're doing. If you had entered a room with the Azerbaijani governments and you were in the position to, let's say, chide them for human rights violations, do you think you would have as much authority to do that after this news had broken as before?
Well, I mean, it would be very hard during this administration under any circumstances. I think where the problem really arises is the whole area of corruption, and thinking of that in the broadest sense, because we have a president who's very transactional, concerned about his personal political future more than what the U.S. national interests might be, and so there would be a number of countries where if an ambassador went in and tried to raise human rights issues or issues of non-democratic processes or Russian interference in their elections, it would be very hard to do that today, given this. But I think, because I believe the Russians were very deeply involved in 2016. I think the Mueller report is right on. I think the so-called Steele dossier is illustrative, if not 100% accurate, of the kind of measures that foreign governments were prepared to take. The president shouldn't have given the Chinese any indication that they too can now join in the fray. Now, are the Chinese going to try to get involved in in our electoral process and other developments? I'm sure they are. I think they would be. It would be totally explicable given the policies they pursued and the measures they've taken. We just recently had this case in Australia where there was a massive cyber attack. The Australians have been very careful to say it was a large state actor, which I think people could understand who that might be. So we know the Chinese have the capability and the intent. So on the one hand, I wasn't surprised in the sense that this is consistent behavior. But on the other, I think that it does make it hard for us to make our case on other issues in other places if we are seen as doing the same thing we're criticizing others for.
Earlier, you alluded to the Chinese sort of influence on the U.S. media. We certainly have not heard enough of the concentration camps in Xinjiang, and you attributed it to China's, let's say, policy or China's influence here in Washington. Does it really surprise you that we hear more and more about foreign powers wielding this kind of influence in the United States, not only on the U.S. political actors, but also on the media? Does the concept of free media sort of concern you at this stage? Not the concept per se, but what we understand as free media. Does it concern you?
Well, I think the difference, today is that it's so easy for people to, and not that expensive, if you will, going all the way from, essentially buying off an expert or a news reporter to report stories in a certain way, or providing money to a think tank to run a seminar or to write a report that makes the government in question look better than it should. It is, it's both a sign of the strength of the United States in the sense that people are able to get their ideas across, but it's also a sign, I think, of weakness of some of our institutions that are now discredited in the public eye because of the ease of placing stories that are clearly designed to influence public attitudes toward a country that may not otherwise be seen positively. It's also, again, I hate to say it this way, but it's easier for a foreign government like China to place stories, to provide resources in the think tank world than it is to change the policy toward the Uyghurs. Which is, that's one way of changing your image, right? But there's no interest in doing that. So take advantage of the openings that are there. I think we're in a very difficult time in terms of the media. I think that people, more than I've ever been conscious of, are prepared to look at one single source of information, particularly domestically in the US, that confirms their own biases and regard everything else as false news or fake news. So I think that's a problem as well.
Listening to you, I was thinking back to the Azerbaijani quote-unquote diaspora organization here in Washington that also employed some of the journalists based in Azerbaijan, based in Washington from Azerbaijan. You know, people who are fluent in English, people who know the life in the United States and understand how people think, more or less. Of course, a comparison will be a little strained, but do you think that one of these efforts to influence the public opinion in the United States was coming from Azerbaijan as well? And to what extent did it succeed? We've seen these Hojali posters quite a lot in the metro. To what extent did the Azerbaijani sort of like attempt to influence the public in the United States succeed?
Well, I don't think it's had that much of an impact, quite frankly. And you know, the one thing that I find interesting, and both Armenia and Azerbaijan do the same thing, it's almost as if they're competing for state legislatures and civil city governments to come out with resolutions or some kind of public statement, whether it happens to be for Hojale or, you know, in the case of the Armenia, the 1915 tragedies in the Ottoman Empire. And you know, quite honestly, I look at that and I say that must take a lot of effort. It probably takes some money because you've got to go out and organize this and help people prep. But the result is I think less effective in the United States, but maybe in Yerevan and Baku, somebody in somebody's office has a scoreboard that they're keeping track of, you know, New Mexico versus you know, some city in California. I don't know. Second point, I think in terms of the think tank and academic world, I have not seen things that have been, you know, so clearly you know, part of an effort directed from Baku succeeding. What I have noticed, and this is personal on my side, there is a lot more serious analysis of situations like COVID-19, like the economic situation that are being written by Azerbaijanis, young Azerbaijanis. I don't agree with everything they write, but it's wonderful. I mean, this is something that wouldn't have happened a few years ago. So, you know, I think to kind of balance it out, there are some other voices now that are coming up. I don't know that they're any more influential than the government is. It's back to the bandwidth problem. I think Washington today, you know, just doesn't have a whole lot of time to sort of reflect on and work on these issues. But I think, you know, there are some changes going on. Back to your first point, that I'm really kind of happy about to see these young Azerbaijani people who have been educated in Europe or in the U.S. Doing some very solid and critical analytical work, which is the basis, you know, for, you know, at some point in the future, I think moving in a different policy direction.
Right. We have a question from one of our viewers, if you don't mind, and the question is regarding the large staff of the U.S. Embassy in Armenia, second in the world after Iraq. I'm not even sure that is correct. I'm sure you will comment based on your knowledge. My question is, once you're done answering this part, when it came to your years of ambassadorship in Baku, what was the communication like between the U.S. Embassy in Armenia and the U.S. Embassy in Azerbaijan, to the extent that you're free to comment? was there a hierarchy? Was there information sharing? Because sometimes I come across the U.S. Embassy in Armenia's posts, and it seems like the two embassies are talking more in the, how do I say this, in the language of the public of the country where they're representing the United States, than coming from a common point of view. So it's very hard to it's very easy to juxtapose the two and see the difference. That's what I'm trying to say. So the first part was about the number of large staff in Armenia. Is that true?
Yeah, I really can't answer that. All I can say is both embassies are multiple times larger than they were when I was ambassador there in 1994. We all of those embassies in Tbilisi, Yerevan, and in Baku were limited in size, and so there were 14 Americans in 1994 when I was ambassador. And there were 14 Americans when I left in 1997. Now I can only imagine how big the embassy is with aid and military attaches and other things of that nature. So regrettably, for me anyway, I think all of our diplomatic establishments have become far too large in this part of the world in terms of being able to produce some return on the investment. Now, when I was an ambassador in Baku, the three ambassadors at Tbilisi, Yerevan, and Baku agreed that we were going once a year to meet in the other's capital. And so the ambassador from Yerevan, and I'm trying to remember whether it was Harry Gilmore or not at the time, and Kent Brown, our ambassador in Tbilisi, and I met in Baku, and we went to see Heydar Aliyev, and we talked about common problems and common perspectives on issues, and I think it may have been a little easier at that point to kind of do those kinds of exchanges of not only best practices about how to run an embassy, but where the policies of the countries where we were representing the United States influenced across the borders. And we encouraged our team, even though it was small, to get out of the embassy and go to Tbilisi and go to Yerevan and see what life's like. And I think there's a tendency all over the world for embassies to take on the character of the country where they are operating. We have an expression in American diplomacy. It's localitis. You forget that you're representing the United States, and you want to defend Yerevan's interests or Baku's interests or what have you. And it's we're smart enough to know when we fall into that trap and can kind of get out of it. But I think, it may be harder today with social media. Every embassy has its own Facebook, Twitter account. I mean, they're doing stuff that I could never imagine. So there's a lot more public visibility of the embassy activity. So it's possible, as your viewer pointed out, for someone to look at what Embassy Yerevan is saying and what Embassy Baku is saying and kind of comparing the two. So that's, I'm not sure how I'd operate in that environment.
It's quite an interesting expression, localitis. Thanks for sort of like expanding my vocabulary. I'm definitely going to use it from now on. Have you, as an ambassador, had the case of localitis? I know that your relationships with the average Azerbaijanis were quite warm while you were there. Did somebody here mentioned that that you did not mention the Armenian Massacre? So you're being diplomatic. Is that because you were based in Azerbaijan? Did that sort of change your views on certain things, on certain perspectives? Is it possible for you to comment on that? Because we hear almost invariably every time that Americans speak about the situation in our region, they bring up the Armenian genocide and the Armenian massacre in this or that term, in one way or the other. Why didn't you? That's the question coming from the audience.
Well, at the time, remember we're in 1994, and the then Clinton administration had not taken a position on what to call those tragic events in Ottoman Turkey, if I can use the two words together, in 1915. So I was always careful about how I described it to keep to what the U.S. position was. And from a personal point of view, as tragic as all those events were, obviously, in the history of the people of not only the Armenian people, but also I have to say that the Turkish people as well, that we have to find a way to deal with the problems where we confront, then in the 20th century, today in the 21st century, not to minimize those historical events. But what disturbs me sometimes is how much projection of history gets made, both in terms of Armenia and Azerbaijan, from these events to affect the unwillingness, I would say, of the governments in Yerevan and Baku to negotiate a settlement on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. History is important. I try to understand it as best I can, but if all I focused on was history, we'd never get to what do we do about today's problems, and how do Armenians and Azerbaijanis find a way to overcome their different histories to deal with these problems.
Do you find the two nations? Sorry if I cut you off. We have a delay here on the internet. Do you find the two nations equally distanced from history, or do you find that one side or the other clings to history to a greater extent than the other one? And does it impede the entire process in your view?
Well, I think that both are tied up in history, and I think their different versions of history keep them from making progress. I'm not. People criticize me for not taking a side. I had the same problem in Bosnia, I might add, as someone of Croatian descent. All the Croats in Bosnia expected me to take their side. And the job of a diplomat is to look at the reality as it is, understand history as they can, and then try to find solutions to current problems that both reflect the interests of the United States, but also the people who are involved in the conflict. Can I just add something that occurred to me, certainly in the last few weeks, as we've struggled with our own issues in the United States of social justice, that history becomes very critical for our own experience in the United States. And as I was thinking about, how do we achieve social justice at home and still be able to talk about problems of not only external conflict but human rights violations abroad. We have some of the same challenges, I think, in America today.
Do you think the United States will be drawing on the example of other nations in overcoming history? And are these experiences at all comparable? Is there something to learn?
Well, I remember the great attention that was given to pulling down statues around the former Soviet Union when independence, including some in Baku. I would note, and now we're going through the same thing here. At some point, if you take this to its logical conclusion, no one is immune. It's not just in our case, Civil War generals who fought for the Confederacy, but now George Washington, basically anyone who was alive in the period of slavery.
Ulysses Grant, even. Does that surprise you?
So I don't. I'm not a real fan of statues, I guess. they tend to collect birds and bird droppings in Washington more than illuminate, my own sense of history. But it is, I think, an example of the misuse of history on both sides, that we've now reduced what is a serious question of social justice to, which statue of what historical figure is present or not. So yeah, we'll have to figure out how other countries have successfully dealt with this problem. I was always impressed with how Germany dealt with this. One of the last trips to Europe that my wife and I took was a river cruise of the Elbe River, and we started out. Can't remember started out. Ended up in Nuremberg, and it was very illuminating to not only see the Zeppelin field where Hitler gave his speeches, but to go to a document center that had been set up in a former Nazi building, where school children from all over Europe were brought to learn about how Nazism came about in Germany. And it was striking to me as we had our tourist tour, at the same time there were these young people who had no knowledge of what went on during that period of their own history, but were being educated with images and words from that period. Just a striking example, I think. And I thought at the time, I said, what could we have a museum of the Confederacy like this in the United States, where you would go and kind of, maybe we do to a certain extent with the African American Museum in downtown Washington. But this was a museum built around a specific tragic historical event that the people of Germany wanted to perpetuate so that their young people could learn not to do it. And somehow that's, I think, the challenge that we face in this country. I would say people in Armenia and Azerbaijan face the same challenge, but it's really going to be important to figure out a way we get past, tearing down statues and figure out what's best for the country.
Speaking of what's best for the country, in our previous conversation, you spoke of, to some extent about some of the politicians and the government bureaucrats that were still in power while you were there, and they were still in power as recently as about 7 or 8 months ago when we spoke. I'm alluding to Ramiz Mehdiyev. I will show on screen the article I'm talking about. It's in Azerbaijani, but I'm pretty sure you had a chance to look at it. This is the article penned by Fazail Agamalı, the chair of the Anavatan Party, the Party of Motherland. And in the bold typeface here, the people can look it up and Google Translate it. It is pretty critical of Ramiz Mehdiyev and his role as the patron saint of some opposition groups. A lot of allegations there, a lot of stuff to unpack. Are you surprised that, without getting into the details of the Azerbaijani internal politics and the opposition politics, but are you surprised with the fall from grace of Ramiz Mehdiyev at all?
Well, in one sense, I'm not surprised. I mean, he is not a young man. Let me put it that way. He's been he had been in that position as chief of the apparat from the time that I was ambassador until now, and his principal deputies were the same people who were there when I was there. But recall, we had started to see kind of changes of what one might call the old guard, whether it was the Minister of Defense, Abiyev, who was, essentially fired because of the controversy over recording the American ambassador in his office, We've had Usubov leave the Ministry of Interior. We've had changes in the Ministry of National Security. Now more recently, the Minister of Culture, who again, another figure who had been there for a long time. And so I would say part of it is just a natural, finally, a natural fact that these people are getting old, and it really became obvious that it was time to go. What I find interesting is that with Mekhteyev, at least in the first instance, he was not sent to a happy retirement, but moved over to the Academy of Sciences, I think is, I'm not sure what the formal Azerbaijani name is. And there was a period where he was as publicly visible as he had been when he was head of the apparat and naming people and developing activities and all. And then when, in recent months, when President Aliyev, in talking about, opposition in Azerbaijan, referring to people as being the fifth column.
Right.
Well, where did those words come from? You can go back to December of 2014, this, what I call the Mekhteyev polemic, which to me was a signal of a firm break with the Heydar Aliyev approach and a more pro-Russian approach that I think has continued to this day from Ilham Aliyev. But he has been kind of at the, wherever he has sat, at leading this anti-Western, anti-modernization effort that I think continues to this day. Now, this article, again, I've only seen the Google Translate version of it. I don't know what that means. Could it be that this is going to be the first step toward removing him even more from a position of influence? Or is there something going on inside Azerbaijan that reflects some sort of, if you will, conflict that we're only seeing parts of? And I think the same thing could go for the corruption allegations about the press fund and the role of Ali Hassanov. I always get his last name confused with others, so if I misidentify him, apologies. But I think those two gentlemen are people to watch in terms of what happens next. And beyond that, I really don't know. Listen, when I left Azerbaijan in 1997, the thing that was most striking to me was how little I knew. And so here we are much later, and I'm still in that same position, that there are a lot of things that are going on.
You and I have left Azerbaijan the same year, it seems, 1997. But this clean break from Heydar Aliyev approach, as you termed it, was it, did I understand you correctly, was it the approach of sort of like balancing between the West and Russia? And do you think that clean break continues until now? If you look at the recent events, does it, do you have the same impression?
Yeah, I mean, Heydar Aliyev was, first and foremost, a nationalist. Whether you agreed with him or not, he was an Azerbaijani nationalist, and what he did was, on behalf of the people of Azerbaijan, as he understood it, and he saw it was important to have good relations with the West, obviously because of energy, but also because of Russia, and I think he knew better than anyone the kinds of problems that Moscow could cause in Azerbaijan if there was not some external, if you will, countervailing force in play. But I've felt all along that Ilham Aliyev's ties were more to Russia, just given his own background and all. And he saw the West not as helpful, but as harmful to his interests, because we were always raising questions, we being the United States and some European countries, about human rights violations and the failure of democracy. And this ran counter to the image that he wanted to project to the rest of the world. Russia, on the other hand, doesn't threaten him in that respect at all. I mean, Putin will not criticize him for failure to have democratic elections, and Russia has gone out of its way in every respect but one to be very, very supportive of Azerbaijan, and that one is Nagorno-Karabakh.
Do you think that outweighs everything else?
Yeah. But to answer your question, I see no sign that this pro-Russian orientation that I think again was signaled back a few years ago is continuing to this day, and it's tricky. It is very tricky now because Azerbaijan is in a very difficult position with Iran, with Russia, with declining energy earnings, and the fact that U.S. companies have been pulling out of the Azerbaijani energy sector for their own reasons. It's not a political statement. This is very much a commercial issue for American companies. They simply can't justify to their shareholders strong investments in traditional oil and gas resources in the Caspian. So.
I would be amiss if I didn't ask you. You alluded to Ilham Aliyev's comments earlier this year, in March, I believe, where he called the Azerbaijani opposition the fifth column. Do you think that is fair? Do you think that is a fair assessment of what's going on? You were an ambassador in Baku. Of course, I don't expect you to open up and tell us everything we're not supposed to know, this and that. But I really doubt that the opposition was coming to the U.S. Embassy for marching orders. I mean, that would probably be preposterous to assert. Does it seem like a fair sort of like fair game to you for the president to accuse his own citizens of serving foreign interests? He didn't name names, he didn't mention countries, but I'm pretty sure he would have mentioned the United States, right?
Right. Yeah, and again, this is kind of the parallel interests of Putin's Russia and Ilham Aliyev's Azerbaijan. You portray the non-government organizations, independent press, opposition political leaders as being being directed by external forces. Otherwise, the people of Russia, the people of Azerbaijan only support the government. It's only these outside factors that result. Look, when I was there, this Section 907 of the Freedom Support Act kept us from doing things that I would have liked to have done with the government of Azerbaijan, with Heydar Aliyev. Even, he was not, he was not a great Democrat, in terms of his opposition to some of the political forces and even free speech. But on the other hand, we could have done some things with judicial reform and development of a truly independent media, if we had been allowed to provide assistance in the same way that our embassies in Tbilisi and Yerevan were able to provide such assistance to their governments. So we missed an opportunity. What we could do was help support an independent media. And we did, we provided where we could, where we knew the media was independent, support. We worked through the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute to support non-government political parties because we couldn't in the same way. And so there was a sense, I think, even from Heydar Aliyev that the United States was not providing an equal playing field for our limited economic assistance. But that was more a function, I think, of the Freedom Support Act 907. But I understand what Aliyev's doing today. This Aliyev, it's too bad. But we're not. The U.S. is not trying to organize a fifth column to overthrow the regime. farthest thing, I think, from the mind of this administration.
Right. This administration is a topic for a separate discussion, I would say.
Yeah.
We've been keeping you for a while here now, and allow me
Yeah,
to ask.
I'm sorry.
Allow me to ask one last question, and we will let you go. You alluded to Iran a little earlier. In our previous discussion, you cautioned the government of Azerbaijan, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly, of finding sort of like lining up or aligning with any security sort of actions that may threaten Iran, and to position itself as a security threat to Iran. If I remember what you said correctly, you will correct me, of course. Do you think that the government of Azerbaijan is cautious of Iran right now? Because we hear, to put give a context to this question, we hear that the government of Azerbaijan is negotiating with Iran about the construction of a bridge from the occupied territories of Nagorno-Karabakh to Iran, which to me, it makes very little sense. Unfortunately, the government of Azerbaijan is not likely to come on my show and answer these sort of questions. Does it make any sense to you? I mean, and especially looking at it from the logic of any security arrangements aimed at Iran, how much sense does that make?
Well, yeah, I've been kind of curious about that, and then there've been a series of stories that I've noticed recently where the spotlight's been thrown on Iran providing things, truck images of these trucks going into Nagorno-Karabakh that somehow have come from Iran. Look, Iran has been playing a very subtle game for a long time in this part of the world, and they are no more interested in than Russia in kind of removing whatever leverage they have on both Armenia and Azerbaijan to advance their own interests. And Azerbaijan, on the other hand, has every reason to need a not hostile relationship with Iran. I mean, look, the border is there. Even setting aside Nagorno-Karabakh, you've got Nakhchivan, which relies maybe less than it did during my time, but for energy and other resources that come through Iran. What I find interesting is that Azerbaijan has gone out of its way to advertise its good relations with Israel. And on a diplomatic level, I can understand why that's important. On the other hand, the military assistance that Azerbaijan is receiving, you can't expect the Iranians simply to ignore that. And I'm not going to pass myself off as an Iranian expert. But the more that Azerbaijan talks about their relationship with Israel in the security area, the more likely it's going to be that Iran is going to find ways to remind Azerbaijan that Azerbaijan does face some security vulnerabilities of its own in the region. So I think rather than this expression of surprise that somehow Iran is providing support to Armenia, I don't know if that involves military equipment. That's another story. But Azerbaijan shouldn't be surprised by that, because the more they talk about their relationship with Israel, the more that's going to give reason for people in Tehran to act the way they are.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you as always for your insight, for your answers. We've kept you close to 1 hour. I hope we didn't bore you to death.
Sorry to monopolize your time.
No, absolutely. It's always a pleasure. We hope to get to talk to you soon. And please convey our warmest wishes to Anne from the audience. I'm reading comments here, and from myself. And we hope to see you soon and talk to you again.
Well, she was always the best representative of the United States in Azerbaijan.
Well, she was definitely not the worst. I'll tell you that. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time and attention. It is 2 p.m. on the East Coast here in Washington, D.C., and it's about 2200 military time, 10 p.m. in Baku, Azerbaijan, where the majority of our audience is located. If you happen to come to our channel by chance, we hope that you do that more often, whether you speak Azerbaijani or not. We try to broadcast in English as well as Russian, and our majority of our programs are in Azerbaijani, of course. Well, like and become a subscriber to our channel. We could definitely use your support. We hope to see you sometime very soon. Thank you very much for your time. Bye.